Welcome to Module 4, creating a new client record. So this module is designed to talk you through how to create a new client record, including the consent process. Probably allow kind of 15-20 minutes for this module. And I'll talk you through the slides, and I'll take you into the training sandbox and show you how to do it. And then there's an exercise for you to do to create your own record in the training sandbox. So the first thing to do before you create a new record on the by name list is it's really important to check that the record doesn't already exist. And you can search for the record using the search bar either on the top navigation or on the left-hand side. If you try adding a new client with the same name and date of birth, the system will show an error message, so you shouldn't be able to do that. Sometimes duplicates are unavoidable. For example, a person may only share their real name or birth date a few weeks later. And so if you do identify a duplicate record, then please let N Street Sleeping team know so that we can merge the duplicates together. And the ESSC team also runs regular checks of the by name list to identify those potential duplicate records. So you've checked the person doesn't exist and now you want to create a new record. So you do this by clicking on the Create New Client button, either on the home page or the left-hand navigation menu. So there's 2 mandatory fields and 2 optional fields required to open a new record. The first name and date of birth are mandatory, and note that the record cannot be saved unless the person's age is older than 60. You'll notice that once a client record is created, the access button is displayed in grey, and you must have a valid consent in place to actually open the record. So the consent on the by name list, clients must give consent to having their information on the by name list. And the consent process gives the option for people to restrict certain organisations from viewing their record. So you can see if there's a restriction in place under the Service Provider Restrictions tab. There are 2 types of information stored on the by name list, personal and sensitive. So when you update a field marked sensitive for the first time, the system will trigger an additional consent notice, and you must gain consent to collect this information. So for non-health workers, the only sensitive information on the by name list is a person's First Nation identity that's found in the support tab. And for health workers, there is additional sensitive information, and there's an additional training for health workers on this. So to complete a new consent, you go to the navigation tab and press the new consent button. The consent form and collection notice will appear, and read this through with your client. So you then select the district that you're located in. If the person consents, then check the box marked I consent. A second box will appear asking if the person wishes to restrict consent to an organisation, and check this box only if the person would like to do so. Then save the button at the top of the element, and a confirmation notice will appear. If the person does wish to restrict consent, then a list of organisations will appear, and select restrict next to the applicable organisation. Save, press save and complete to complete the process with the applied restrictions. And the completed consent will then appear in the consent tab. The VO-SPDAT is optional on this version of the by name list. Some communities like to use a VO-SPDAT survey when working with a person for the first time, and it can be really good to identify someone's vulnerability and to help with that triage process. So to complete a survey, you open the newly created consent and then press the Start VO-SPDAT and then complete the survey as normal. And there's additional training on how to complete the VO-SPDAT survey that's available on our website. And that should only be completed by people who are trained, but it's no longer part of the core training. It's an optional training for those that will wish to use the VO-SPDAT survey. Okay, so your exercise for this this module is to create a person on the by name list and create a record and complete consent to unlock it. And then you'll be using that in the next module, in module 5, to kind of update and add information to that record. So what I will do now is take you into the training sandbox and run through that in the training sandbox. So as I mentioned, there's 2 ways to create consent. There's this create consent button, and then there's also create a new client on this left-hand navigation. So let's click this create consent. There's two pieces of information that are essential, and that's the first name and date of birth. So let's put Katie, and date of birth, remember, just needs to be older than 16 to be added to the by name list, and it won't let you add someone older than 16. But essentially, once you have those pieces of information in there, you can save and it will create the record. You can also add, a surname, and you can add a lead worker. So if I add a lead worker, so for example, if I add myself there as a lead worker, it adds my contact details on there. So if I save this now, this has created the client record, but I can't access that because there's no consent yet. So I go into consents, new consent. And then this is the consent form. So read through this with my client and make sure they understand the consent. And a good tip is to print out a copy of this beforehand, so that you have a copy to go through with your client and that they can look through that as well. But you go through the consent process with your client, and then if they consent, you add a district that they're consenting in. Check I consent. If they want to restrict consent, click this and then save. So this creates the consent process. Now, because I clicked that I wanted to restrict consent, it will now give me the option to restrict, and it brings up these list of organisations. So I can say, want to restrict consent to End Street Sleeping Collaboration. So that restricts consent to End Street Sleeping Collaboration. Save this, save and complete. And so now this creates the record, and this will open up so that I can click through to a full client record. I can click on this consent tab here to see that consent. So if you're looking for a new client, you can look and see when their consent process was done. And I can also click on here, service provider restrictions, and it tells me who is restricted from seeing their information. If I go back to this summary, and then to access the record, I click access Katie's record. One other thing is the VI-SPDAT, which we talked about, which was optional. So to do a VI-SPDAT, if you are going to do that, you go to consents, you open up the consent process, and then you click Start Survey. And then this is the same as how we've always done the VI-SPDAT surveys. And there's additional training for those of you that haven't done training, that haven't done VI-SPDAT surveys previously. That's probably it now. So I will leave you to go back to the exercise for this module, which is essentially to log in to the training sandbox and to create a client record that we'll then use in module 5.